Well, today on Data Skeptic Animal Intelligence, we're talking about bioinspired engineering. Becky, can you give some thoughts on the research that our guest today, Brian Taylor, gets into?
Sure. So one of the things that Brian is really interested in is this sense that some animals have called magnetoreception. So they're able to sense in one way or the other the Earth's magnetic field, and often they're using that for navigation. So learning how evolution is produced a navigational system, we can reproduce that in robotics. So that's where the bio inspiration comes from.
Yeah, it's really neat to me to think that we might be able to use lower quality sensors like GPS. Your phone gets super hot when you use it. There's a lot of compute going on. Something's burning the battery there. If there were more subtle ways we could use weaker sensors, maybe in concert or in some way, that could be a much more optimized solution, at least on an electronic. And it seems like maybe nature found a lot more of those optimized for low energy type solutions.
Absolutely. And anything that doesn't require satellites also seems beneficial as well, just from a cost perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Is this a rare thing for a lab to be doing, or do you see a lot of departments like this?
I think in engineering departments, you see a lot of things like this. Some other examples I can think of are the stickiness of gecko feet and how that works, because that's van der Waals forces. So, can we make reusable tape that's based on gecko feet? So, that's a good example. And then when we were talking with our honeybee folks, Anna and Barbara, I think they also do some bio inspired robotics with like insects and how they're able to navigate and do things with small brains, and how can we make more efficient robots and littler robots. So I think this is something we see a lot in engineering and possibly physics and some of the other more hard kind of sciences.
I hope it's an emerging field. I don't know who to credit this to, but I remember being told that when discussions were taking place for the probes we were going to send to Mars, which I guess ended up being Curiosity and Opportunity, there were two probes. One proposal that obviously wasn't taken was that instead of sending two probes, we send 2,000 probes, but they're all identical and all quite basic. And then, if you lose a handful of them or lose 10% of them, not really a big loss to your mission. But the criticality of some of these things might be one of their flaws. And that certainly has happened on a lot of space missions. Perhaps an army of little agents that are bio inspired could be the way to go.
Absolutely. I kind of like the numbers game, expect it to fail. I think one thing that was really interesting about Brian, because we talk a lot about bio inspiration, but one thing about magnetoreception is that there's a lot of hypotheses about how it works physiologically and neurologically in animals, but we don't know for sure exactly how it works. And when you have someone that does research like Brian, who's doing computational simulations for how it might work, you can actually, from the bio side, from my side, say, I have this hypothesis for how it works. Can you build me a computer simulation and see if it's able to function just like the animal can? Can it navigate? So it's almost the opposite of bio inspiration. It's like the biologists are doing the hypothesis generation, and then the engineers are able to confirm or deny, like mechanically, can that work in a simulation? And I thought that aspect of Brian's research was really cool.
It's surprising to me that there's a mystery there. The science of mathematics are pretty well established. It's Maxwell's equations, right? And the math is pretty easy. It's fields and the right hand rule and all this kind of stuff. Like we understand the mechanics of it. And I know there's like the ferroactive stuff in the brains of birds and stuff that they found, but why shouldn't it be easy that there are just some neurons attached to that, and those are the ones that read the signal? I don't know. Do you have a sense of what the mystery is?
Not as much as maybe I should as a biologist that's interested in behavior, but I could see how that could get complicated pretty quickly. Because if you think of spatial navigation in mammals, we're looking at a structure in the brain called the hippocampus, and we're not talking about a few neurons that are easy to measure. You're talking about many, many, many neurons that are going to vary quite a bit by individual and the experience of that individual. So my guess is magnetoreception is similar. Biologists are probably biased towards studying humans and other animals that don't have highly developed magnetoreception senses. You're probably not going to find a bunch of sea turtle brain experts, more in the birds. That's probably our best bet. So I could see us understanding the mechanics of the phenomenon and being able to make simulations and reproduce it. Yes, we understand how magnetic fields work, but how a squishy brain, a pile of fat and salt is able to interact with, like you were saying, iron to produce the same effect and process it and get the animal to behave properly, that's harder.
Well, that's a good reason to do some experiments in silico, as they say, that we can simulate these things and see how they pan out.
I haven't heard that before. That's great. In silico. I'm gonna have to use it.
All right. Well, let's get into the interview. Look, everybody, data science has been reshaping every industry, and that's not slowing down. All this AI stuff is just going to accelerate it. So whether you want to advance or pivot your career, you should consider the Georgia Tech Scheller College of Business and their 100% online Business Analytics Graduate Certificate program. It'll teach you how to analyze and interpret data. The skills you learn will allow you to succeed anywhere. This online program consists of 4 courses: Business Analytics for Managers, Machine Learning for Business, Business Data Preparation and Visualization, and Analysis of Unstructured Data. It's a flexible program. You can go at your own pace. Those of you who want to hit the gas hard can take 2 courses a semester and graduate within a year. The Business Analytics Graduate Certificate is designed for professionals in any industry who want to become data-savvy leaders or pivot into analytics. It can also be your gateway into a Georgia Tech MBA. So are you ready to become a data-savvy leader? Get the skills necessary to do that. Applications for the Georgia Tech Scheller College of Business Business Analytics Graduate Certificate are open now for spring 2025. Visit techgradcertificates.com to learn more. And don't forget to apply by October 1st. That's the deadline. For more information, head over to techgradcertificates.com.
My name is Brian Taylor. I am an assistant professor of mechanical and aerospace engineering at Case Western Reserve University. The research that I and my lab do is based around biological and bioinspired sensing, processing, and navigation. So, what we really care about is understanding how animals, well, it's a twofold type of a deal. So, we care about understanding how animals sense the world around them and know where they are and how they get, and then how they navigate from point A to point B. One of the main things we look at, not the only, but one of the main things we look at is animal magnetoreception. So their ability to sense the Earth's magnetic field and use that as a navigation cue to get them from point A to point B. This is something that, despite decades of study in the biology community, it's something we really, as a community, still don't understand that well. What my lab does is we bring engineering, we bring a lot of different tools from engineering and applied mathematics to try to help get a handle on how do animals do this really interesting and awesome kind of a feat. This allows them to navigate across continents and oceans. That's one kind of side of things, trying to understand the biology of how this works. The other side of things is, remember I said I work in an engineering department, so I want to make things, right? We want to make tools that can help improve people's lives, make society better. So if we look at how humans do navigation in modern times, we rely on satellite-based navigation. So think of the United States and GPS, or Galileo and the EU. Different countries have their own satellite-based navigation types of programs. So satellite-based navigation is wonderful. I mean, I haven't had to say I'm lost in a really long time. I remember the days of you memorized the directions before you got in the car, and now you just say, you get in the car, all right, going here, all right, and you let it tell you how to go. So satellite-based navigation is a wonderful thing, but it can become, well, for one, it's expensive. It cost the US $2 billion, I think over $2 billion in fiscal year 2022. So it's expensive. It can it can become unavailable or unreliable for a variety of reasons, some of which are naturally occurring, some of which are man-made. Some of these reasons are rather innocent. Some of these reasons are someone's trying to sabotage it or doesn't want you to use it. So that's a problem. And then also, satellite-based navigation doesn't really work underwater. Once you get a little bit underwater, you can't access that signal anymore. And so water covers like 2/3 of the Earth's surface. So if you want to do anything underwater, you need some other alternative. We look at animals which are able to navigate across continents and oceans. And to my knowledge, sea turtles and birds have not launched rockets to, have a satellite constellation. And they're able to get across continents and oceans. So the question is, well, they're doing something right. They figured out a way to deal with this. So maybe there's something we can learn from them that allows us to make better engineered systems.
In terms of the navigation, how well is it understood? Like, is it just some vector math or is there an algorithm? What's the bird using its senses and then processing them? What's actually taking place to navigate?
Oh, this is a good question. And I think we're still trying, I think we as a community are still trying to figure that out. I'll put this in sort of like three bins. The first bin is what's the sensor? How do they actually sense the world around them, right? That's an open research question. So if you ask me how you see, I could tell you that your eyes, right? If you ask me how you hear, I could tell you that your ears, and we could even talk about the bits inside of your ear and how they how they interpret a sound wave and turn that into something your nervous system understands. If you ask me how an animal senses the Earth's magnetic field, I will tell you that there are two hypotheses and that there is evidence for and against both of them. Well, two main hypotheses. There are some other ones as well that have recently been put forward. One hypothesis basically posits that you'd have like something like magnetite or a magnetically sensitive material that would actually be physically moved around by the Earth's magnetic field, and then when this material is moved around, that would effectively convey a signal that neurons would be able to then sense and transmit through the nervous system. So that would be how you would go from this thing in the world to something a nervous system can understand. The other idea out there is it's you might see it called a radical paramechanism or it's more of a chemical reaction type of a mechanism. But basically, the idea is that you basically would have a chemical reaction that is affected, mediated, altered by the Earth's magnetic field, and so based on the interaction of this reaction with the Earth's magnetic field, you might be able to then figure out, oh, so this was like the particular direction that I was pointing in relative to the magnetic field. There's evidence for and against both of these. There's been things where it's like, oh, this is really promising, and then there's evidence out there where it's like, oh, well, this is a problem. Then there's the bit of, okay, you have this information. Well, it's got to get combined with, it's got to get processed and combined with all the other information you take in. So we don't completely know or understand all of that, partially because we don't know what the specific sensor is. And then the last bit is, okay, now that you've done all of that, you have to use that information and do something with it. So a good analogy would be, okay, you've seen a bowling ball that's flying towards your face. You've identified this is a bowling ball. Bowling balls are heavy. If this hits me, it'll hurt. That means nothing if you don't then tell your muscles to make you move to get out of the way of said bowling ball, right? So it's the same sort of thing. Even once you have all of that, then you have to figure out, okay, so how does the magnetic field information you sense and in conjunction with everything else get turned into flap your wings this hard, flap your flippers like this, walk in this direction. So those are sort of three tiers that there's active research into to really try to understand how does this work.
And could you speak to some of the, like, I guess, methodologies or approaches you use for the study of animal navigation? Like, is it computer simulation? Are you tagging birds? What's the source of your data?
Okay, so the way what my lab does in particular is we really apply, I would say, computational and physical system or hardware based approaches to try to look at magnetic field navigation. So a lot of work in computer simulations, and then also implementing what we find in simulation in robotic platforms. As far as the types of things we'll try to test or hypotheses we're trying to test, or maybe if we're trying to come up with different hypotheses, we actually go to the animal literature. So I have colleagues who are biologists, and they actually, like I have a colleague who works with sea turtles. Some of the work we've done has been based on some of the data and the results and the findings that that he's gotten. Some of the work we've done has been based on the observations and findings of other people who might do work with birds or different types of animals. But what we specifically do is we'll say, so there's been a lot of work out there where people might say, oh, well, it looks like animals might do this to get around, or maybe they could use the magnetic field like that to get around. These are good hypotheses and everything. They're not always the easiest things to test. If we think, okay, this is what we think the animal is doing, then we should be able to basically code that up. If we get answers that or results that don't mirror what we see in the real world, that's an indication that, oh, okay, we don't really have, maybe our understanding of this isn't complete, because as implemented, we can't get this hypothesis or this strategy to do what we think it should do. But this is an interesting area because then you can say, well, what could we do to our strategy to make it work or to get it to work? And then if you can come up with something that's biologically plausible that actually gets it to do what you expect to see in an animal, that is now something that you could go actually look for in the animal. And the benefit of doing the work the way we do it is you can do experiments where you're just looking at what happens when you sense the magnetic field. You can do experiments where you're having a simulated animal navigating around the Atlantic Ocean. People do track animals, but it's kind of hard to say, okay, I'm going to release a bunch of turtles into the Atlantic Ocean, some of them experimental, some of them control and track what they do. And then I'm going to, like, I don't know, change the magnetic field around the Atlantic Ocean or the salinity of the Atlantic Ocean and repeat the experiment. That's a challenge. It's hard. You can do that in a simulation and you can do that in a robotic platform. Yeah, so we use a mixture of simulations and then robotic platforms where the platform can sense where it is, and then based on what it senses, it's able to move in a particular direction.
Well, could you speak in more detail about the simulation and like its implementation? Are there tools you can leverage, or are you deep down coding everything?
Sure. So we've done up to date, we've done a lot of deep down coding everything. We basically do agent based simulations. So you have the world, yeah. So the sensory environment that the agent, which is a proxy for a fictive animal or engineered vehicle that's moving around, but you create the environment that this thing can sense. You create this agent which can move, which has different ways in which it can move around, and then you have some type of navigation strategy or algorithm where based on what it senses it tries to move in a particular direction. And then what we end up doing is we say, okay, we're going to let this thing run and see if we can, maybe we might see, can it navigate to these points over n circuits, right? Can it make n loops of this, or does it get lost? Another approach we've used is we have some navigation strategy. From some of the work we've done, we know it can get to certain places, but maybe it fails in others. So then there's a question, well, are you guaranteed to reach certain places, right? If you have this strategy and you start at a given point, are you guaranteed to reach an endpoint? Or the other way you could ask that, is that point doomed to failure, right? You're never going to reach that point. And so we've also looked at work where we try to maybe do some more math based on dynamical systems differential equations to try to really see, does it look like you're guaranteed to reach a point which would indicate likely navigation success, or are you doomed to failure? Even in the cases where you're doomed to failure, maybe you're doomed to not ever get exactly to the point, but maybe you can get close enough where, or preliminary work indicates maybe you can get close enough where some other type of sense could get you the rest of the way there. So for instance, if you walked into your house and you smelled pizza, you would start sniffing to figure out where the room the pizza was coming from. Once you found the room where the pizza was, you'd use your vision to take you directly to the pizza. So it's the same kind of a thing, maybe using the magnetic field to kind of get you in the vicinity of some goal, and then using something maybe like olfaction or vision to take you the rest of the way there. We just had a paper come out last month that was using this kind of approach of saying, are you guaranteed to get to certain locations on the earth, depending on what your navigation strategy is and how you set the parameters of that strategy.
So, in an agent based simulation, somewhere in there, that agent could be described as a data structure. It's probably got a position, which is like a vector of two, maybe three dimensions.
Mhm.
Could you describe what sort of data structure you work with when describing the agent?
The agent has basically, it's got its position, possibly an orientation, and then it's just got the elements of the magnetic field that it can sense based on the strategy we have. So we've looked at strategies where you're only sensing inclination. So for instance, we think that some birds might use an inclination based kind of magnetic compass. So they're looking at maybe navigating based on how the inclination of the magnetic field changes. We've implemented strategies that are based more on using combinations of intensity and inclination as to kind of give you, think of it as a magnetic address. So green turtles would be a good example of this. So green turtles they'll go from Brazil to Ascension Island, which is this tiny little island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. It kind of still wilds me out that, like, if you look at a map, you see Brazil, big country. Ascension Island, this tiny little like pinprick of an island. It's like they get from there to there. Yeah, an idea is that if you know the inclination and intensity of a goal like Ascension Island, and you can measure the inclination and intensity of where you are, then you might be able to basically say, oh, based on what I sense and I know where I want to go, I should go this way. If the magnetic field were this nice rectilinear grid, this would be kind of boring and simple, but the magnetic field is not this nice rectilinear grid. If you look at lines of constant inclination, lines of constant intensity, they're warped and twisted. So you may not go necessarily in a perfectly straight line from point A to point B. The short answer to your question is we'll have things where we have position, maybe orientation. There's the specific strategy. In some work we've done, where we started doing some early forays into looking at energetics or the energy you're using while you're navigating. You might also have things like the energy level of the agent and how fast that energy level is dropping. So,
Well, agents have to make decisions. I think in your case, it's what you were calling a strategy.
yes.
Could you describe what the under the hood implementation of strategies look like?
As an example, in the work that we've done on what our lab is called magnetic signatures, again, this really just means some combination of magnetic intensity and inclination that would give you an idea of where you are. So what we will basically do is like I said, we'll sense that inclination, that intensity, and then we'll say, okay, this is what we sense where we are. We know we want to get to this particular point. That gives us kind of a direction in which we can move. Once you have that direction you want to move in, you can basically then you can say, all right, let's just pretend for now that corresponds to moving in like some XY space, right? So now you can move in a particular direction. Again, because the lines of the magnetic field are very warped and twisted, you might think, oh, I'm moving due east, but in reality, you're moving like you might start off moving southwest or doing something that's not what you quite expected. You can do things where you scale basically the importance of inclination and intensity. So you have this measurement you take and you can scale each one of those things independently of each other. So you can basically, so maybe for one particular animal living in, or one animal or agent that's in one location, maybe intensity measurements kind of count as more important, and in another location maybe inclination measurements count as more important. Maybe in some areas you might kind of slap a minus sign on one of the things that you sense to kind of make you go in a different direction based on some of the things we're looking at with that. These are akin to sort of, if you're an animal that evolved in this particular location, maybe you could use this strategy, but the parameters you kind of might have evolved to work really well in that particular area. Whereas if you're like a loggerhead sea turtle navigating around the Atlantic, maybe your navigation parameters might have evolved to work in that area, versus if you're some like a salmon navigating somewhere in the Pacific, maybe your navigation parameters or your algorithm has evolved to work really well in that particular area. That's a lot of the baseline of what we've done. To go a little more into your question, so everything I've talked about now has just been sort of you sense the field and then you do something. Well, if you're an animal, everything that's in the world has to get turned into something your nervous system understands, right? Because that's what ultimately does the processing. So another thing that we've also looked at and have done some work with is using basically computational neuroscience approaches to basically sense the magnetic field and then actually do the processing. And so what we'll do is you have basically a bunch of hypothesized magnetic field sensors that will detect the magnetic field. That goes into a computational neuroscience method that's based on the dynamics of how real nervous systems work. And then the output of that basically artificial nervous system serves as the input into our navigation strategy. So I call that kind of like an end-to-end simulation, because you're really looking at the thing in the world getting transformed into something the nervous system understands. You have the nervous system processing that information, and then the nervous system spitting out, you need to go this direction, and then and then a specific algorithm saying, all right, based on what we got out, this is what we need to do.
We haven't touched too much on the robotic aspect of your lab yet. Could you share some details on some of the projects you've got going on?
My lab has sort of two robotics tracks, I guess you could say. So we have untethered robots, where we have simplified sensing but real world motion control. And we have tethered robots, where we have simplified motion control but real world sensing. So in the untethered robots, my lab has particularly used the iRobot Create system, which these are really repurposed Roombas. But no, they're really awesome because this is not meant to be an advertisement, but they've been helpful for us. So they're basically Roombas, but you can actually plug into them and like plug a Raspberry Pi in or something like that, and now actually have a program that controls what the robot's doing. we have this robot operating in a motion capture environment. The motion capture system sees where the robot is, and based on where the robot is, we then tell the robot what it should sense as far as the magnetic field. And then based on what it should sense, it comes up with, okay, I need to move in this particular direction. The sensing is simulated because we're really going based on where you are, this is what you should sense. But the robot is not physically connected by wires or anything to anything in the world. So when it tries to go straight, so you get all the fun of like, oh, the robot thinks it wants to go straight, but it drifts off to the left or the right. Or the robot is supposed to rotate, maybe 25 degrees, but because it happened to be a little too far rotated one direction, it ends up rotating minus something other degrees, right? So you have real world motion control problems you have to deal with. You have to deal with, oh, the robot went over something that occluded its motion, and so that now affects its ability to get from point A to point B. And that's really important because, and especially anyone who has done robotics could tell you this, you could build the best control system, navigation algorithm, whatever. You could build the best thing you want to build. When you hit go, gravity is always going to win. Gravity is undefeated. So you could have an algorithm that you think this is wonderful, but what happens when there's disturbances that you didn't expect? How does your navigation algorithm respond to that? Because you might have something that works with perfect information and perfect sensing and perfect actuation. You don't get that when you're dealing with an untethered system that is battery operated. The other system we have is, I called it, it's a tethered system. So what we have is a rate table, which is really a fancy robotic lazy Susan. They actually use these in aerospace industry for testing out things like inertial measurement units. We take this lazy Susan or this rate table, and we put it inside of an artificial magnetic environment, which is a very fancy way of saying a box with wires around it. Because when you run current through a wire, you can generate a magnetic field. And so what we can do is on this rate table, or kind of a little bit away from the rate table, we can put a magnetometer that can sense the magnetic field, or several magnetometers, or maybe if we really want to in the future, we could put like a vision sensor or something. And so the idea here now is that give this magnetometer any magnetic field that we want to give it based on the navigation algorithm we have and what the magnetometer senses. It can make the rate table spin to change its orientation. If you in software pretend that the table is actually translating in X and Y, because the table can only physically rotate, but if you pretend that the table is translating in X and Y, you can make it draw paths. So what's nice about this system is it's very simplified motion control, because you're having to pretend it's translating and it only rotates, but it senses a real world magnetic field using a real world magnetic field sensor, with all of the fun in terms of if there's noise in the system, if you have some weird hiccup in the system, if I remember this with my PhD work. If the system was working fine today, and then tomorrow it's not working because something decided, like a fuse decides, oh, I don't want to be here anymore, or something decides, oh, I'm not connected anymore. It's simplified motion control, but now you actually are dealing with sensing a real world signal. And so you can actually get a better idea of how your algorithm is going to work. And so what's nice about this is you can now test this. You can run experiments in very simplified, abstract magnetic environments, which we've done. You can also start to run experiments in more realistic looking magnetic environments, but you can do that all from the comfort and convenience of a lab without having to go and rent a plane that has magnetic sensors on it every single time you want to test a strategy out, because that's like really expensive, and I would like to go home and eat dinner every night. So
And to what degree is the robotics work bio-inspired?
this is very bio-inspired. So we do a lot of work in simulation, and then when we've kind of, at least the way the lab has progressed, we've done a lot of work in simulation, and then we've said, okay, this works in simulation. What happens now if we try to put this into a robotic system? The work we'll do in simulation, that might, as I've mentioned, that might be based on what we think sea turtles might do or what birds might do. So the algorithm there is based on what we think an animal might be doing. And so then we can take that same exact algorithm and stick that into either of the robotic platforms. So the sensing and all of the processing in all of these things is really, it's all operating based on what we think an animal is doing. In the case of our rate table, something we started exploring, if you remember, I mentioned that end-to-end approach where we have the physical world and then like a nervous system and then like a strategy. So our rate table, we actually started exploring that, where we have our sensor, but then the way that information is being processed is with this sort of artificial nervous system type. In this is sort of this artificial nervous system. So all of these things are operating in a bio-inspired way.
And are there any major open questions you're working on?
There's a series of questions we're working on and that we're interested in. Again, there's these ideas about how you might use the magnetic field to navigate, right? So what is the navigation strategy and algorithm? So that's something that's open, that I would say we're working on. So I told you about this magnetic signatures type of idea. I told you about birds using inclination compasses. We have work that's gone on into those. So how you would actually use the magnetic field. We started doing some work into sort of what might be the actual physical magnetic sensors that are at play. So I mentioned this sort of, I'll call it magnetite hypothesis and this radical pair hypothesis. And so both of these types of sensory mechanisms would be believed to maybe convey different magnetic field information. So what we've started looking at is, and I've mentioned this sort of end-to-end approach, to something we started doing, and we have some papers out on this, is saying, all right, well, we think maybe this magnetite hypothesis, it sounds like it could give you inclination information and intensity information. All right, so let's try to see, we think this is how this sensor might work. Let's code this sensor up and then connect it to something that looks like a nervous system and see if we get out the results that this hypothesis says we should get out. We did that. That's published, that's out there. So then other things we've done after that are saying, okay, well, this looks like it could actually work. Let's connect this now to the navigation algorithm and see, can you actually get something to move from point A to point B? We still don't know exactly what the animal is doing per se, but this gives us a warm fuzzy that, all right, this is a plausible thing that could be going on, right? This is a plausible thing that the animal could be doing. As more animal work is done and and people figure out all kinds of clever ways to do novel animal experiments, that's something that you can actually go and test. There's a little bit of looking at the different sorts of sensory mechanisms and how those connect to actually moving around. Some other open questions that are out there. One of my colleagues I know works on this. Is magnetic field information something that is maybe like, do you take a lot of measurements over time and kind of put all that together, or like, are you instantaneously sensing things, or how are you so something we also have thought a little bit about, and that's actually kind of curious about, or how does magnetic field information interact with other sensory information. So I remember one of my colleagues, when I was first getting into this stuff and talking with him about different experiments, and so you want to do experiments with the animal, but then you really have to kind of, no pun intended, get in the animal's head of, well, what does it care about? And then you have to remember, most animals don't sense one thing, right? They sense a lot of things. And then animals go through different stages of development where you care about different things. So I was running different ideas by him about, well, could we do something like this? And he said, yeah, so the problem is if we do an experiment like this with like a juvenile animal, they really, really care about like food. If there's anything that like with food, they might kind of just say, oh, we want the food. And I remember I was talking to him in his lab. He's got turtles in the room and they're kind of chilling out doing their thing. And someone from his lab came in because it was feeding time and they've had this orange dish. And you see the turtles like start doing acrobatics and pirouetting in the water and everything. So it's like, oh, like I got what he meant and I believed him. But when I saw it, I was like, I would not have thought all of this unless I saw this going on. There's questions about, one, what are the specific sensory mechanisms that are used? How is that information combined, like represented and combined in the nervous system with other sensor modalities like vision, olfaction, all these other things? And then what are the actual navigation algorithms that are used? So there's a lot of different open things out there that we are looking towards. I think to really make progress on this is very interdisciplinary work. So we've talked about biological magnetic navigation, but the people that have worked in my lab, we've had people whose undergrad who have majored in or are majoring in mechanical engineering, aerospace engineering, biomedical engineering, electrical engineering, quantitative biology, biology, applied mathematics. Who am I forgetting? Am I forgetting anyone? We had someone who actually studying forensic chemistry who did some work with us one summer. So the point here is the work has been very, I would say, is very interdisciplinary, and this I really like, because I think to really make progress you need people from who been exposed to lots of different disciplines and can wear different disciplinary hats and can put all of that together. I think at least for my lab that's really helped us to be able to make progress. Computer science, that was one I can't forget. That's like whoa. And yeah, I mean, a lot of the work we've done, it's required some mechanical and aerospace engineering. If you're looking at things like energetics, all of these things require some element of programming. Some of the work we've done and systems we've built have really required a lot of software development. All of these things you have to put into the context of what does this mean for an animal, and what does this mean for how an animal is sensing the world and doing its thing. And so for that, you really need biology. Quantitative biology is really important because you need to be able to go from what is the animal doing to how do we get this into a computer, because that's critical for then how do we get this into a computer or a robot. All of these things have to really work well together.
Well, Brian, where's the best place for listeners to go online to learn more about you and about the lab?
So I actually moved to my current institution from I was at a different institution previously, so we're getting our site migrated over. You can find me at Case Western Reserve University in the Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering Department. Our current lab website, we've got a lab website that is currently at Taylor Lab at web.unc.edu. That's where I was at UNC Chapel Hill before I came to Case, and we're currently migrating that over to a website at Case. So checking out our website is a great place to go. Our lab is on Twitter, X. Those are the best places to get to find us. I am also on LinkedIn, so if anyone wants to shout at me on LinkedIn, or if you, again, like I said, if you go to Case Western Reserve University, you can find me there. If you we have people who are curious about things and send me emails, and I do get back. I do respond to people. This is how I found people. So this is how I found some people to work with me.
Very cool. We'll have links in the show notes for listeners to follow up. Brian, thanks so much for taking the time to come on and share your work.
Thanks for the opportunity.